วัสดีค่ะนักลงทุนทุกท่านวันนี้นะคะลูกแก้วก็จะพามาพูดคุยนะคะกับเทรนด์การลงทุนระดับโลกนะคะที่ตอนนี้เนี่ยเรียกว่าเป็นกระแสหรือได้รับความสนใจในช่วงนี้นะคะกับตัว global infrastructure ค่ะเชื่อว่าในช่วงที่เกิดความไม่แน่นอนนะคะในสถานการณ์สงครามต่างๆที่อาจจะต้องรับมือกับเงินเฟ้อเนี่ยนักลงทุนหลายท่านอาจจะอยากหานะคะสิ่งที่เป็นสินทรัพย์หรือว่าตัวเลือกของกองทุนนะคะที่จะสามารถช่วยในการป้องกันพอร์ตโฟลิโอจากดาวไซด์ริสได้นั่นเองค่ะเราจะเห็นได้ว่าในช่วงที่อัตราเงินเฟ้อเนี่ยปรับตัวเพิ่มสูงขึ้นนะคะเรียกว่าตัว global infrastructure เนี่ยก็ถือว่าเป็นหนึ่งในสินทรัพย์เลยนะคะที่มีความน่าสนใจเพราะยังสามารถสร้างรายได้ที่สม่ำเสมอนะคะอีกทั้งมีตัวความเสี่ยงที่ต่ำนะคะนอกจากที่ไม่เพียงตอบโจทย์เรื่องเงินเฟ้อแล้วเนี่ยตัว global infrastructure เนี่ยยังสามารถตอบโจทย์ในธีมการลงทุนระยะยาวได้อีกนะคะเพราะว่าตอนนี้เนี่ย AI กำลังมาต้องการใช้พลังงานต่างๆหรือ global infrastructure ต่างๆเนี่ยก็ได้ประโยชน์ในส่วนนี้เช่นกันนั่นเองค่ะวันนี้นะคะรู้สึกดีใจเป็นอย่างมากเพราะว่าจะได้พูดคุยกับคุณ Matt Bushby นะคะ Head of APEC Business Development นะคะจาก Franklin Templeton นั่นเองค่ะเพราะทาง BBLAM ของเรานะคะก็มีความร่วมมือนะคะกับ global partner ระดับโลกนะคะในการค้นหากองทุนที่เป็น best asset class มาให้นักลงทุนนั่นเองค่ะ Good morning BBLAM investor and คุณ Matt Bushby Global Infrastructure Continue is an offer about the compelling investment opportunity in an environment of the rising inflation its stable income stream, exposure to a long-term structured team, and listening across about the sector make global infrastructure an attractive to addition in portfolio. Today, I would like to take about the three questions to talk about the global infrastructure trend. The first question, considering about the global inflationary pressure and the geopolitical tension. In the text of ongoing US and Iran tensions and the global inflation, how can global infrastructure provide protection through about a stable income and yield?
Infrastructure assets have a very unique way that they earn their return over time. Now, just to put in context, what we're talking about here are essential service assets. Electricity, gas, water transmission and distribution, some renewable energy, maybe some traditional energy networks like gas pipelines, transport assets like roads, rail, airport and the like, and some communication assets like cell towers. The way that these assets generally earn their returns is under regulation or long-term concession agreement. And because they're essential, because they need to grow over time, they need to attract investors to fund that growth, the regulation and contracting environments make sure that investors are protected from events outside their control. Things like interest rates, underlying energy prices or inflation in particular are passed through at regular intervals to the company to allow them to increase their price. We see that in our power bills, unfortunately, but it means that the company is protected, and around 90 to 95% of the portfolio has a direct or indirect pass-through of inflation. That means that as their earnings go out into the future, you can be reasonably confident that that level of inflation will get passed on over time. Now that might take 3 months, it might take 3 years, depending on the regulatory cycle of the particular company or the concession agreement that it's operating under, but we've seen time and time again that that inflation protection does actually come through. And in the context of the current geopolitical stresses that we're seeing around the world, that level of inflation protection we think is very important to have embedded in your portfolio, because once the market starts to get concerned about inflation, typically that already starts to get priced in. So by having it in your portfolio, in the bottom drawer, we like to say, enables you to keep that level of inflation protection in your portfolio and still benefit from some of those long-term themes that infrastructure is very known for.
Global infrastructure can hedge about the inflation and the long-term growth. And looking about the question 2, looking at the characteristics of the list of infrastructure, why is global infrastructure considered as a defensive asset in a diversified portfolio?
So just if I back up a little bit, some of the characteristics of infrastructure investments are structural growth exposure, and we see that through some of the really long-term themes that infrastructure is exposed to, such as AI and power demand, electrification and decarbonisation, or investment in networks such as grids or rearranging supply chains as manufacturing moves from offshore to onshore, for example. They also are very attractive in terms of income provision. This particular strategy aims for a dividend yield above 5% over rolling 5-year periods, something it's been able to achieve since the inception of the fund. And with a level of inflation protection, as I mentioned earlier, around 90 to 95% of the portfolio has a level of inflation protection either implicitly or explicitly through the agreements they operate under. So bringing all of those together, it means investors can get defensive equity exposure. And by that I mean, we won't participate as much as global equities in the upside, but we won't fall as much in the downside either. So that long-term compounding effect is very powerful. And over time, a reasonable proportion of total return expectations is in the form of dividend yield. So a base level of dividend return plus some growth on top, combined with inflation protection over time, we think is a very attractive asset to have in portfolios.
And the next question is about the question T, considering about the current market condition and circular trend. Why is now an attractive time to invest in global infrastructure? And how do circular tailwind is example is about the energy transition, AI and data center power, network investment, drive capital spending and earning growth? And what that means for the next stage for this investment for the global infrastructure?
So infrastructure is exposed to a number of very long-term structural growth opportunities. AI and power center demand, energy efficiency, decarbonisation, electrification, as well as the broader theme of network investment, be they energy networks, grid investment, or changing supply chains as industrial activity is brought onshore to many countries. They need good supply routes to get their raw materials in and their finished goods out. All of those themes really provide a tailwind to the investment that's needed in infrastructure. And the key concept for infrastructure investors is asset-based growth. As these companies invest in their assets to make sure that the power is available to data centres, to make sure that the grid is resilient enough as we add new sources of energy such as renewables into the grid or charging electric vehicles at different times of day, all of that investment is added to the asset base, and on that asset base, investors earn an allowed return from regulators. So all of these powerful long-term secular growth trends are accelerating the earnings that these companies are able to provide. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the current 5-year period, EU energy networks will grow their asset base about 50% more in the current 5-year period than they did in the 5 years prior to that. So there's a good acceleration there. A fast-growing US utility a decade ago might have been growing at 4 or 5% per annum, whereas today they're growing at 8 to 10% per annum. But most importantly, despite this uptick in growth, we've seen trading multiples remain relatively steady. So as broader equity markets are at or near all-time highs, infrastructure and utility trading multiples, so the EV to EBITDA multiple is what I'm talking about here, is largely in line of where they were around a decade ago, which means that the growth that we've seen over the past 10 years in infrastructure and utility assets have been backed by the EBITDA growth of those same assets. So it's a great entry point into these very attractive assets.
This is a time to invest about the global infrastructure.
Yes, we think it's a very attractive time to invest in global infrastructure. They're not immune from the broader stresses of the market, but they are quite unique in how they earn their returns over time. So separating sort of the fundamental aspects of these businesses and all of those structural growth themes that I've mentioned versus the sentiment side is very important. From a sentiment point of view, markets are a little choppy. We've seen stresses in the US and Iran situation contribute to falls in markets. Infrastructure's been relatively resilient. It's fallen, but it's only fallen by about 70% of the global equity markets. And in fact, year to date, as we sit here today, the infrastructure index is up around 7% year to date, which is showing its resiliency in the type of environments that we're in. But going forward, we believe that the fundamentals will play out over time, and infrastructure long term will track the growth in the underlying assets and the EBITDA that unique return profile underpinned by regulation and long-term concession agreement can provide to investors.
Thank you, Mr. Ma, to talk about the global infrastructure. This is an interesting trend to invest in about the hard term and invest in the next step. ท้ายที่สุดแล้วนะคะเราจะเห็นได้ว่า global infrastructure นะคะไม่ใช่แค่สินทรัพย์ที่จะพูดถึงในการที่จะมาป้องกันความเสี่ยงของตัวค่างเงินเฟ้อหรือว่าเศรษฐกิจหรือความผันผวนต่างๆนะคะแต่เป็นเทรนด์การลงทุนระยะยาวที่จะสามารถสร้างรายได้ที่มั่นคงและอย่างยั่งยืนนั่นเองค่ะสำหรับวันนี้นะคะหากใครสนใจลงทุนนะคะในเทรนด์นี้นะคะอย่าลืม B-GLOB-INFRA จาก BBLAM ค่ะ